You're here, but you're not really here. You're in the room, but somewhere else entirely. You're in the conversation, but watching it from a distance. You're living your life, and somehow, you're not inside it. And the strange thing is, you've gotten used to it. You don't always notice when it happens. One moment you're present, and then, without choosing it, you're gone. Somewhere in a memory. Somewhere in a future that hasn't arrived. Somewhere in a version of yourself that feels more real than the one sitting in this body right now. Most people call this distraction, but distraction is just the surface. Underneath it is something much older, something you've been carrying for a long time without quite knowing its name. Your mind doesn't escape randomly, it escapes purposefully. And the question worth sitting with, the one most people never ask, is, what, exactly, is it running from? Not what are you distracted by, what are you avoiding feeling? There's a difference, and that difference changes everything. Think about the last time you truly couldn't be still. Not physically, mentally. The last time silence felt unbearable, and you reached for your phone, or a thought, or a fantasy, or a memory, anything to fill the space. What was underneath that silence? What was waiting there, in the quiet, that you didn't want to meet? Because the mind doesn't escape from boredom. Boredom is just what we call it when we don't want to look at what's actually happening inside. The mind escapes from feelings that don't have a safe place to land. Grief that was never fully grieved. Anger that was never allowed to exist. Longing for something you can't even name. A self that got buried somewhere between who you were supposed to become and who you actually are. And here's the part that matters, the part that most people miss entirely. Escaping isn't weakness, it was, at some point, survival. If you learned early that certain emotions were too much, too inconvenient, too frightening, too unwelcome in the people around you, then your mind did something incredibly intelligent. It learned to leave. It learned to go somewhere safer. It built an exit, and that exit worked for a while. But exits that start as protection have a way of becoming prisons. If this is landing somewhere close to home, if something in you recognizes this, then you're not alone in it. There are people watching this right now who have spent years not understanding why they feel so far from their own lives, so quietly. If you feel seen here, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly this kind of reflection, for the people willing to go inward. Now, back to the escape. The mind doesn't just escape into nothing. It escapes into something specific, and what it chooses reveals a great deal about what it's protecting you from. Some people escape into the future, into plans and fantasies and versions of tomorrow where everything finally works out, where they finally feel okay, where the version of themselves they've been working toward is finally real. The future is a very comfortable place to live, because in the future, you never have to feel what you're feeling right now. Some people escape into the past, into old conversations replayed with different endings, into moments when things were simpler, or when they felt more like themselves, or into wounds they keep returning to because the wound, at least, feels familiar. And some people, maybe you, escape into a kind of internal commentary, a running narration that observes your life instead of living it, a voice that watches from above, analyzing, interpreting, keeping a safe distance from the raw experience of being human. All of these are the same mechanism dressed differently. They're all ways of staying close enough to your life to function, but far enough to avoid being fully inside it. And you can sustain that for a long time, years even. You can build an entire existence around being almost present, almost here, almost yourself. But there's a cost, and the cost isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. The cost is a low, persistent feeling of unreality, like watching your life through glass, like something important is happening just out of reach and you keep arriving late to your own experience. If you've ever looked around at your life, a life that looks fine from the outside, and felt something close to emptiness or distance, or a vague grief you couldn't explain, that's not a character flaw. That's not ingratitude. That's what happens when a person has spent a long time being somewhere other than where they are. And here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the psychology stops being about pathology and starts being about something more honest. Carl Rogers, one of the most quietly radical psychologists who ever lived, Believe that human beings don't drift from themselves because they're broken. They drift because they learned very early that being themselves came with conditions. He called it conditional positive regard, the unspoken message that love, approval, safety, belonging was available, but only if you showed up in certain ways, only if you suppressed certain feelings, only if the version of you that appeared in the world was acceptable. And so people learn. They learn to edit themselves, to perform, to become fluent in the language of who they're supposed to be, until they've practiced it so long that they've lost the original tongue. The escape from reality isn't random. It's the psyche trying to avoid the pain of that performance, trying to find somewhere, anywhere, where it doesn't have to keep pretending. And this is what's worth pausing on. The mind that keeps leaving the present moment isn't failing. It's signaling. It's telling you, in the only language it knows, that something real is underneath all of this, something that hasn't been allowed to surface. The escape isn't the enemy. The escape is the symptom. And symptoms, when you stop fighting them long enough to understand them, become maps. Think about what it would mean if every time your mind drifted away, instead of pulling it back with frustration, you asked, with genuine curiosity, where did it go? What was it looking for? What was it trying to protect? Because there's a version of this that's not about failure of attention. There's a version of this that's about the mind doing its best to keep you safe from something it decided, somewhere, at some point, was too much to feel. And that decision was made with the information available at the time. A child who learns that expressing sadness makes the people around them uncomfortable will eventually stop expressing sadness. But the sadness doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And the mind learns to redirect, to think about something else, to imagine something else, to be somewhere else, before the sadness can surface and cause the problem it once caused. Decades later, that same person sits in a quiet room and can't figure out why they feel so restless, why they can never just be still, why peace, when it actually arrives, somehow feels more threatening than the noise. Because peace is just another word for the silence where the feeling lives, and the nervous system still remembers. Silence is where the unwelcome thing waits. There's something else worth naming here, because not all escapes look like daydreaming. Some escapes look like productivity. Some people run from themselves by staying relentlessly busy, filling every hour with tasks, obligations, goals, not because they love the work, but because the work keeps the silence at bay. They confuse movement with aliveness. They confuse output with presence. And from the outside, they look like the most functional people in the room. On the inside, they're exhausted in a way they can't quite explain. They've learned to perform engagement so convincingly that sometimes they fool even themselves. Some escapes look like caregiving, like people who are endlessly available for everyone else's emotional needs while never once turning toward their own. They've made themselves indispensable to others, and in doing so, they've found a legitimate, socially praised reason to never sit still long enough to feel what's actually happening inside them. Some escapes look like cynicism, the person who has learned to keep an intellectual distance from everything, turning every feeling into an observation, every moment of vulnerability into a concept, not because they don't feel, but because feeling directly became too dangerous at some point, and the analytical mind became the only safe room in the house. All of these are the same escape, different costumes, the same door. If you've been watching this and something in you is quietly recognizing itself in these words, that recognition is worth something. It means the distance between you and your own experience is not as vast as it sometimes feels. There's awareness already present, and awareness is always the beginning. If this channel has become a space where you do this kind of inner work, consider leaving a like. It helps this reach someone who might be sitting alone tonight with that same unnameable heaviness, wondering if anyone else feels it too. And if you want to, drop something in the comments. What does your escape look like? Where does your mind go when it goes? There's no wrong answer, and you might be surprised by how much you find in the language of your own response. Now the question that matters: what does it feel like to actually be here? Not conceptually, not as an intention, as a physical, lived, immediate experience. What does it feel like to be present in this moment, in this body, in this life, without immediately reaching for something else. For a lot of people, the honest answer is uncomfortable. And that discomfort is the most important information in the room, because presence isn't peaceful by default. Real presence means contact with what's actually happening, with what's actually being felt, with who you actually are right now, not who you plan to become or who you used to be. And if real contact was painful for long enough, the nervous system learns to avoid it. The mind learns to float just above it, close but not touching. The return to presence, the real return, not the performative mindfulness version, isn't about forcing yourself to be still. It's about becoming curious about what happens when you stop leaving. What's there when you stop escaping? What feelings show up? What truths become audible? Not to fix them, not to solve them, just to let them exist without immediately running. And there's something important here that often gets missed in every conversation about presence and awareness. Being present isn't the same as being comfortable. The goal was never comfort. The goal was contact. Contact with your actual experience. Contact with the feelings you've been trained to edit. Contact with the parts of yourself that learned to stay quiet so the room wouldn't get tense. Those parts didn't disappear. They learned to wait. They became the undercurrent beneath everything. The low hum beneath the busyness. The slight tightness when things get too still. And the more the mind escapes from them, the stronger that pull becomes. Not louder, just more constant, more pervasive, more woven into the texture of ordinary days, until eventually the escape itself becomes exhausting. Because here is what's true, and it takes a long time to actually believe this, not just understand it. The feelings you've been avoiding are not as destructive as the avoidance itself. The grief, when you finally let it move through you, does not swallow you whole. The anger, when it's allowed to exist, doesn't turn you into someone unrecognizable. The longing, the uncertainty, the rawness of not having it all figured out, these things, when met with presence instead of escape, begin to integrate. They become part of you instead of the thing beneath you that you're always trying to outrun. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from a life spent slightly outside of itself. It's not the exhaustion of too much activity. It's deeper than that. It's the exhaustion of constant self-management, of always being slightly ahead of your own feelings, making sure nothing gets too close to the surface. That vigilance takes energy, enormous amounts of it, and most people don't realize how much they're spending until the day something cracks open and they find themselves feeling something they've been avoiding for years, and discover that the feeling, in the end, was survivable. More than survivable, actually. There's something on the other side of the feeling that the escape was always keeping you from. Not resolution, not peace, necessarily, but a kind of solidity, a sense of being real, of being actually located inside your own experience instead of watching it happen from somewhere slightly above. And that solidity, that realness, it's subtle at first. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It arrives as a slight shift in how it feels to inhabit a moment, a conversation that lands differently, a silence that, for the first time in a long time, doesn't need to be filled, a heaviness in the chest that you let sit there, without immediately diagnosing it or distracting from it, and somehow it softens, not because you resolved it, but because you finally acknowledged it was there. That acknowledgement is its own form of presence, and presence, however small, changes the relationship between you and your own inner life. You stop being a stranger to yourself. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. This is what Rogers meant by becoming a person, not achieving a better version of yourself, not fixing what's broken, but allowing the full texture of your experience to exist, including the uncomfortable parts, and discovering that you're still there on the other side of it. The self doesn't shatter when you stop escaping. It becomes more coherent, and slowly, not dramatically, not all at once, the present moment stops feeling like something to survive. It starts feeling like somewhere you can actually live. You start arriving, in small ways, in quiet moments, in a conversation where you're suddenly, genuinely there, not watching yourself have it, but inside it. In a morning where you notice the light without immediately thinking about what you have to do. In a feeling that you let exist long enough to understand it. in a moment of stillness that doesn't feel like danger. These aren't milestones. They're just moments of contact, moments of being in your life instead of adjacent to it. And they accumulate, not into perfection, into presence. The distance you felt from your own life, the strange sense of watching it happen, of always being just slightly behind or ahead of the moment you're in. That distance wasn't proof that something was fundamentally wrong with you. It was proof that you were doing what you had to do with what you were given. It was adaptation, intelligent, effective, and ultimately incomplete, because the version of you that learned to leave in order to survive, that version was doing its best, but it was working from an old map, a map drawn when the feelings were too large for the container, when the environment couldn't hold what you were carrying. The container is different now. You are different now. And part of what it means to grow isn't just accumulating new experiences. It's learning that the old strategies don't have to run on autopilot anymore. You can notice the exit. You can feel the impulse to leave. And you can choose, just sometimes, to stay a little longer. Not because staying is easy, but because what's here, even the difficult things, belongs to you. They're yours. And there's a particular kind of wholeness that becomes available only when you stop outsourcing your own experience to somewhere that doesn't exist. You're not here, not fully, not yet. But the fact that you feel that distance, the fact that something in you recognizes the gap between where you are and where you could be, that recognition is not a sign of how far you have to go. It's a sign that something in you still knows the way back. You don't have to have this figured out. You don't have to stop escaping all at once. You just have to be willing every now and then to stay a little longer, to sit with what's actually here, to let the present moment be imperfect and unresolved and still, somehow, real, because that's where your life actually is, not in the future you're building or the past you keep revisiting, but here, in the uncomfortable, unpolished, undeniable now. And maybe that's enough to begin with, just that, just here.